Welcome to Flight Club. We take off soon. Make yourself comfortable. We recommend getting a drink and headphones. Yes, headphones are essential. The first rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. The second rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. This flight will never stop. Welcome to Flight Club. Welcome to Flight Club. This flight will never stop.
Flight Club. Flight Club. Flight Club. Flight Club.
Welcome to Flight Club. We take off soon. Make yourself comfortable. We recommend getting a drink and headphones. Yes, headphones are essential. The first rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. The second rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. This flight will never stop. This flight will never stop. Welcome to Flight Club. We take off soon. Welcome to Flight Club. This flight will never stop.
Hello everyone and welcome to Flight Club, our nice live YouTube show. Today we have another very exciting guest. Matthew Skelton is with us, and well, I'm the co-host of the show, so there is another host, which is Cliff. Hi Cliff.
Hello and good evening and welcome everyone. Yes, as Klaus says, this evening we have Matthew Skelton who's joining us. We were supposed to have Manuel, his co-author. Unfortunately, he is sick and he sends his apologies. But we still have all of Matthew, and we will have some really, really interesting conversations. So welcome, Matthew. Do you want to say what's up to everybody?
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Lots of people from all the way around the world. So it's great to be with the Flight Club crew today on this flight.
Cool. So yes, some of you may know actually that this week we're trying out something different. So we've actually co-hosted this event with Lean Agile London. So big thanks to Jose, JP, and Ahmad. They have been also talking about this, and so some folks are joining us from that community as well. So if you're joining us for the first time, big welcome to you. Of course, a reminder to everybody, if you like the show, please hit the like button, give us a thumbs up on YouTube, and of course, if you hit the subscribe button, that means you will also get updates about this video and other video content that we put out as well. Cool. Yes, there is one other person that I want to just quickly say a thank you to actually before we start, because without this person, none of this would have been possible. So Neil Cook, I hope that he is actually on the live stream. I have not seen him yet, but Neil Cook was actually in one of our training classes a couple of months back and mentioned to us about the Team Topologies book that he'd read and connected us with Matthew and with Manuel. And as a result of that conversation, we're actually here today having this conversation. And so a big thank you to Neil for making this all possible and for teaching us about Team Topologies. Big thank you to you. Cool. Klaus, you were going to add something about Neil's contribution as well. Do you want to add anything in there?
No, it was just like we were talking about the work systems topology in the workshop. Because work systems topologies is a thing in flight levels where we try to somehow figure out what are actually the work systems that we need in an organization and how are they connected. And he was like, I read this book, Team Topologies, and maybe you can combine these two approaches somehow. And yeah, this somehow got me interested in the topic. Of course, I read the book and everything. And well, I'm just running a flight level systems architecture workshop, and I will try some of this stuff out tomorrow in the morning. So yeah, let's see how it works. But yeah, I'm very optimistic. It really fits quite nice together. That's what we're here.
Very cool. Cool. Yeah. So, Matthew, we have a lot of interesting things we want to talk about. So I want to just jump straight in and get started. The first thing that was kind of in my mind when we were talking about all this preparation is a lot of the time I run into folks doing different things. People have learned a lot of different tools and models. And one of the things I've probably done this more than my fair share myself, taking a model and applying it basically to every context that I can kind of imagine. And I think that this is perhaps a little bit, I don't know, maybe using a hammer to look for nails is kind of maybe not the best way of going about this. So before we get too much into the details, I'm curious, what was kind of the context or the history behind how Team Topologies emerged, and what kind of context are you using this in?
So it's a really good question. It's a really important thing to focus on. What is the context in which something works? So the clue actually in the Team Topologies book is on the front cover. So you can see there are subtitles of Team Topologies: Organizing Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow. So if we're in situations where you're working in a business context, or also in a governmental context as well, so public sector, but if we need a fast flow of change to IT systems or to software systems, then that's where Team Topologies comes in. There are other situations where it might be not suitable. We don't really know yet. But for example, in research and development in kind of scientific or engineering contexts, where you're doing novel research. Maybe it's not relevant there. Maybe it's not relevant in some kind of, it's not necessarily relevant in manufacturing, for example. It might be. It's not necessarily relevant in some other kind of administration areas inside an organization. But certainly if you've got an expectation of a fast flow of software changes, supporting some business goals, then we believe it's entirely relevant in that space. We've actually heard of some organizations using some of the patterns even outside of IT as well, like in legal, and there was a legal department using it. There was, I think, an HR department was starting to look at how to use some of the patterns as well. So it may be applicable outside of IT. That would be great. But certainly inside kind of IT software changes, and when we need a fast flow of change. And for most organizations building and running their own software systems, we do need a fast flow of change because we need to change the systems to deal with regulatory changes, trade changes, changes in trading rules, changes in the market to deal with competition, but also to deal with bug fixes. So there's a zero-day vulnerability. We need a change to be able to flow quickly through to the production system. It's relevant in all these contexts.
So I was kind of thinking as you were saying this, is that if you want a fast flow, I guess if people want slow flow, then they probably shouldn't use Team Topologies.
Indeed, that's right.
If that's the goal. But maybe not so many companies looking specifically for slow flow, but yeah. Cool. So I actually forgot to say this earlier, but I just want to remind everybody, as we're talking, please shout out your questions in the chat. Of course, if this is your first time, maybe you don't know all of this, but basically shout in the chat. We'll try to weave these into the conversation as much as possible. And the questions from you really help us to add kind of color and go in sort of a more interesting place than just what is kind of in our preparation and prior discussion. So yeah, please ask questions in the chat. Cool. So I wanted to explore a little bit. So firstly, I want to say I really enjoyed reading the book. So thank you for writing the book. It was one of my favorite reads of the last couple of months for sure. And one of the things that I really liked in there is that you explore a lot this concept. Two things that really kind of stuck out for me, aside from the 4 patterns, which we'll come to in a minute. But basically the effects of Conway's law and talking about the consequences of cognitive load for the individuals who work within a team or within an organization. And I'm curious, how was it that you arrived at these 2 specific things? What was it about them and why was that important for you?
That's a nice question. I think that's the first time I've been asked that question in exactly that way. So I've always been really interested in kind of how systems work and what constitutes a system. So I studied control engineering and system science at university. And so on that particular course, it was actually called cybernetics, and we looked at systems in a much more general sense. So we did some work on planetary systems, on kind of business and organizational systems. For example, I did a research project on insect vision, how insects see, and what were the current models and awareness of how insect vision works. So because that's obviously outside of kind of traditional IT, it's not Java programming or anything, but so my background includes a kind of awareness of systems in a broader sense. And so when I first came across Conway's law, I think that was back in, I first encountered it, I think back in about 2011, 2010, something like that. It struck me as something that was quite profound. Like, if it's true, if Conway's law is true, I'll explain it in a minute, but if Conway's law is true, it's actually quite profound. It has profound implications for how we think about designing and working with systems in lots of different kind of ways. So it felt important to include. So Conway's law, for those of you who aren't aware, there's a paper, an academic paper written in 1968 by researcher Mel Conway. And he was thinking about how organizations design things. The paper was called How Do Committees Invent? And there's a famous phrase. It's actually a really good paper. It's worth reading the whole thing, and we did for the Team Topologies book. We actually went into the details, and there's some really important things to draw out of it. But the kind of famous phrase that that's often picked out and used as Conway's law is a comment that he has in this paper, which is organizations that design systems tend to produce designs that are copies of the organization communication structure. And this seems to apply to lots of different kind of systems. In the last kind of 10, 15 years, has been work to look at this socio-technical mirroring, as it's really called. And it turns out that there is quite strong evidence this exists in automotive, so car manufacture, in aerospace, so building kind of rockets and aircraft engines, and software as well, and some other disciplines. It's not a law like the law of gravity, but it's a tendency for this mirroring to occur. And so it has implications for system design, but it also has big implications for like the whole organization. Because if we're not conscious, if we're not deliberate about how our organization is designed with this kind of pattern in mind, with this kind of mirroring in mind, then we're in danger of limiting the kind of solutions that we are going to discover. The organization design becomes a limit on the kind of solutions we're likely to find, which is kind of a strategic level problem. If we're not being conscious about what that looks like. So it felt really important to dive into that, and we did lots of research on kind of validity and so on around Conway's law. I've also done some research, and I've had a long-term interest in how our brains work. And so I think I first came across the kind of concept of cognitive load back in something like 2007, something like this, and kind of increasingly became aware of situations in which teams basically had too much to deal with, and the effect on that team. And it turns out there's some research in this space, research in the US Navy in terms of teams, kind of how teams behave when the cognitive load is too high, but also looking at software teams and what happens in these situations. And interestingly, if you look at the research in the book Accelerate, published by the same author same publisher as Team Topologies, so from IT Revolution, there's four key metrics that are indicators of high organizational performance, which is lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to restore, and change fail percentage. And these have effectively been, these are predictors of high organizational performance, things that organizations should be aiming for to make sure that they're heading in the right direction. And all four of those things are negatively affected if cognitive load is too high on the team. So cognitive load becomes a really important thing to address, because if we do not address cognitive load, we are not going to be able to address the key predictors of high organizational performance. So it felt really important to kind of bring these additional concepts in, particularly because lots of kind of software frameworks and ways of thinking just didn't address these kind of things at all. In the past, they just had to just kind of ignore them. In some cases, because they could ignore them. If we go back 20 years, we didn't really need to think too much about cognitive load or think too much about kind of flow of change to production, because we're building different kind of systems. But now, the kind of system we're building have a real danger of becoming kind of way too big and complicated for us to deal with. So we have to think about these additional human dimensions as we're working with this software. It felt really important to include these kind of more human aspects of what we're doing when we're building software.
Yeah,
I really like that. I mean, I think I don't think I've ever worked at a company where there weren't people wandering around saying, you know, we have too many meetings and there's too many things on the go and this kind of thing. And I think at some level that kind of conversation is very often being highlighted by some of the software engineers, saying, you know, there's just so many meetings, I don't have any time to get anything done. And, you know, as a coach, you often sort of push back and say, oh, but, you know, the meetings are part of the work and whatever. That's actually usually more of a signal that the cognitive load of trying to be sort of involved in so many things is just so enormously high. And that's kind of one way that I realized that, so we can see this happening so often in our organization. I think it's such an important factor to consider. Yeah. I want to jump back quickly for a minute to Conway's Law, because I think this is a really fascinating concept. Something that I've done a couple of times just sort of for humor value is that if you're using a company's product sort of from the outside, very often what you can do is you can almost guess that the teams often are not working together, because you can see two features that you're trying to do, try and buy a home loan and sign up for insurance, and the two things are just completely disconnected from each other. And sort of the converse, well, maybe not the converse, but the other side of Conway's Law is that you can actually see it represented in the organization. So, two parts of the product don't work together. It's likely the teams don't work together. They don't know each other even exist, perhaps, in many cases. And yeah, I think it's quite fascinating, because what I find, specifically when we start to get into a lot of the conversations around flight levels, is this kind of getting different parts of the organization to connect with each other and have that conversation. And what I think is really cool is Team Topologies is kind of outlining several patterns and details for not just within the context of a single team, how can we interact, but also doing that kind of, okay, so this is the mode of interaction and conversation we need with other teams. And I really, really find it fascinating to see how this happens. You start to stimulate and kind of create this interaction and conversation. And somehow the people often manage to there's a lot of progress is made just by opening up a communication channel that often doesn't exist in so many of these organizations, because people sit somewhere else, they report to somebody else, they take priorities from somewhere else, but they actually are somehow quite dependent on each other. And it's so valuable to go back in and poke around and try to improve some of this. So before we go too far down sort of the details, I want to make sure that we give a little bit of an overview of like what are these patterns. I think without sort of trying to summarize the entire book, which I imagine, sort of if you want to read the book, then I highly recommend go and read the book. But if you were to sort of try to explain the 4 patterns and the concepts captured in the book to somebody who's never read the book, I'm sure you've been asked that question before. How would you do that?
So our starting point is a fast flow of change from inside the organization towards production. That's our starting point. How can we achieve that? That's the question effectively we ask. And we say, well, one of the things that blocks a fast flow of change is when you have lots of handovers between different teams. So what would happen if we had no handovers at all? What would happen if we had a team that could take an idea from concept through to running in production and look after that service or that software in production? So that's our starting point. And that team is something that we call a stream-aligned team. So it has a mixture of capabilities, cross-functional, some people call it, mixture of capabilities that allows them to build and run a slice of the kind of business domain. It could be an application, it could be a service, it could be a user journey, something that's valuable, and something that is substantially independent of other things. And that stream-aligned team looks after that thing on an ongoing basis. It's not just a 3-month project. They're basically, that team is looking after that for the foreseeable future, potentially many years. Now, obviously, the team members themselves might change over time, but basically, it's nice and stable is that team. So that's our starting point. If you're in an organization where you only need end-to-end product teams like that, you build it, you run it, what we call stream-aligned teams, then you're in a really good place. That's you don't need anything else, because if you found a good boundary of responsibility around this team, then changes will flow down that pipeline, if you like. They'll flow nicely along that boundary, and you're meeting user needs. Why do you need anything else? In practice, inside organizations that grow larger, you end up needing some additional kinds of team, and so we define just 3 supporting team types. One is called an enabling team. One is called a complicated subsystem team, and one's called a platform team. Enabling team is the only team that does not own any part of the software system. Enabling team is there primarily as experts to help stream-aligned teams to bridge some capability gaps. So perhaps the streamlined team doesn't really have enough experience in UX, user experience, or let's say infrastructure automation, or let's say that the streamlined team is not quite sure how to move from one database to another. So we have a team of experts that works with this streamlined team for a short period of time to help bridge that capability gap. The enabling team will also detect common problems across multiple streamlined teams in the organization. And if they see the same problem in several teams, they can say, well, actually, we've got a repeating pattern here. Let's do something about it. Either we need to train multiple teams in a new technique or new technology, or perhaps we've made some incorrect assumptions about what these teams can actually do, or we need to have something provided by another team somewhere else in the organization, typically a platform. But that relationship between the enabling team and the streamlined team is temporary. It might only last days or weeks, because we do not want the enabling team to be a kind of dependency on these independent streamlined teams. And that pattern seems to be really, really useful. It's a way, technically speaking, it's a boundary spanning role. It's a way of making sure we've got expertise available without the expertise being a kind of checkpoint or decision or approval process, which would block a flow of change. So traditionally we had experts in, say, security, compliance, performance, that kind of thing, acting as a block in the flow of change. That doesn't work because we need a fast flow of change. So what we have instead is these experts in enabling teams, helping teams to become more effective at addressing security, compliance, performance, and so on. So where are we? So we're now at the complicated subsystem team. If ideally these streamlined teams would have all the capabilities they need to make changes to their software and deliver those through to production. But sometimes they may have to deal with an aspect of the business domain or aspect of something in this space that needs really specialist knowledge. Let's say we're doing some television adverts, and we need to write a new video processing algorithm. That's quite complicated. That's not something that most people can do who are working on software. That's an example of a situation where you might have a complicated subsystem team when you need real specialists who've got particular kind of mathematics skills. Well, it's not reasonable to have those skills inside the streamlined teams. So we'll actually have it in a specialist team. The danger, of course, is that becomes a blocker. But sometimes it's the right thing. It's driven by reducing cognitive load on these streamlined teams. That's our decision point for having a complicated subsystem team. And the fourth type of team is a platform team. And platform team, the primary purpose of that team is to accelerate the safe, rapid delivery of change inside these streamlined teams. So if one of these streamlined teams, takes on too much responsibility, starts building out lots of infrastructure and dealing with networking and dealing with IoT devices and dealing with all kind of other stuff, yes, they're independent, but now they're moving very slowly. So which aspects of what they're doing are not strongly related to the business domain? Which of those aspects could we actually pull into a platform and have the platform provide as a service to these streamlined teams so they can just use it and go quickly? And that's where a platform comes in. But this kind of modern platform is very different from the platforms of the past. The modern platform's starting point is accelerate the safe and rapid delivery of change in these streamlined teams that use it. So again, and it's kind of starting from this cognitive point again. That's when we decide something to platform. We don't just start with the platform because we can. It's a different set of decisions about how we decide where things live.
Okay,
so you're starting with the flow of value to the customer specifically. Like that's the point, and that's kind of the key. Yeah. I like that.
And
cool.
And another question. So the difference between the platform team and component team, is it like, okay, in the platform team there's really like a life cycle behind it if you launch it as a platform? Because I mean, would you agree when I say try to avoid component teams whenever possible?
So we definitely say avoid component teams. So because component teams kind of come from a couple of decades ago, when the dynamics in the software industry were very different. We were typically building desktop systems. We didn't have multi-node cloud systems with interesting failure modes. in our book, the complicated subsystem team is a very specific thing, and we only have that in place when it is not reasonable to have those skills inside a streamlined team. That's basically the only time in which we would actually pull together a complicated subsystem team. A complicated subsystem is kind of like a mini platform. You can kind of see it like that. The complicated subsystem needs product management around it, lightweight product management around it. We use the same kind of principles as we would use in a platform. It's just that the complicated subsystem effectively is focused on just one thing. But in reality, at some point, a complicated subsystem probably gets pulled into a platform anyway and managed as part of that. It was useful just to distinguish it in terms of sometimes there's some very specific things like a video processing or like transaction reporting or these kind of things where you've got this special set of skills which just focus on this one little thing here, but pretty much every other team is streamlined. It was worthwhile making that distinction. Yeah. But yeah, we should not try to have a complicated subsystem team. If we can avoid it, that's great. We're just aware of the situations in which it might be the right thing to do. Because otherwise the cognitive load on these streamlined teams would be too high and it'd be too difficult for them to have this fast flow change. Makes sense,
yeah. And there's a question, I mean, we're just talking about the type, so maybe we could clarify Klaus's question here, like what kind of enabling teams have you experienced so far? And let me put another question on top of this. So in Flight Levels, we talk about enabling services. And enabling services could be something like the lawyers or, I don't know, the controlling or like marketing, sales, because we need them from time to time, not all the time, but often, right? So, what do you think about this? Would this be an example also in your world?
So it could be. The key thing there is the key test for me is, do we have some expertise that we need to take advantage of within a kind of product team, within a streamlined team? Like we need some outside expertise to help us do something, to help us understand something better, or to help us change from one thing to another. We cannot have that expertise inside the team all the time, for example, because this expertise, because let's say we've got 50 different teams and we've only got 5 people or 6 people with that expertise. So we cannot have that permanently inside all of these teams.
Exactly.
And we also want to avoid a team of experts blocking a flow of change, because in the past we had a team of experts saying, we will assess and inspect every change to make sure it's fine. Okay, when the speed of change is really slow, that kind of works in a way. When the speed of change needs to be very, very quick, that model just doesn't work. So let's take that expertise. And one option is to use it as like an enabling way like this, so they can work with 1 or 2 streamlined teams at a time and help to explain this thing around legal or around marketing or HR or compliance or something like this. Yeah. Help that team to understand, and then that team's now independent again. So we've increased their awareness and knowledge and helped them to understand how and where to find better details about something. Of course, the other thing that we can do with this expert knowledge is say, okay, well, we've actually worked with like 15 different teams now. We've actually got a good sense of where the challenges are. Why don't we actually put something into a platform that helps to automate that kind of, helps to automate something about compliance, for example, helps to automate something about HR. So effectively, we're taking that expertise, we've understood what's needed, seen the patterns, and then we can say, well, we're going to build the platform, or someone is going to build something that makes it much easier for these streamlined teams to be compliant, or to do UX in a really good way, or whatever like this. So we're kind of sensing, we're sensing what's needed and bringing that into another part of the organization. Cool. That feels like a really valuable way to use that kind of expertise in a way which scales fairly well. We're not building something before it's needed. We're actually listening to what's really needed and then saying, okay, this is going to be valuable because we've seen the same problem or the same gap across 15 or 20 different teams.
Yeah.
We were talking about
the bottleneck and then solve it when the bottleneck is there.
Yeah.
I like this one.
I was going to add to just that we were talking about this a little bit in the context of our preparation, and just saying how so often what happens in this work is that a lot of teams sort of have a little bit of a fuzziness around what their purpose is. And what a lot of these conversations are doing is sort of helping people to sort of not just talk about how do we do the things that we need to do, but why are we actually doing this, and what is the purpose behind it. And I think the challenge is that a lot of people have done some sort of vision exercises and these kind of things, and it's difficult to kind of keep it somehow grounded, but it should somehow be a little bit directional. And so I think a big part of the value, both with the team topologies, and I see this in the work that we're doing as well, is helping teams just to have that conversation to say, yeah, we're trying to go left around the mountain rather than, right and under the mountain. And that somehow, it makes it much easier to have the conversations down in the details. You'll have to forgive my metaphors. Sometimes they come out and they're pure gold, and other times they're very strange and weird. But usually they make some sense. Otherwise, they get another iteration. Cool. So I actually want to jump across. There's a couple of really interesting questions coming in from the audience.
There's a lot of questions.
And I'm trying to sort of group them up a little bit in some way. But there was one here specifically, I lost it now. So Daniel Westermeyer is saying that he loves this thought of, we were talking about cognitive load and a bunch of things in that space. He says he can't imagine that this works in organizations that are primarily concerned with resource utilization. Do you have any ideas around how to communicate kind of this importance? So the context there was, we were talking about, how cognitive overload can be such a challenge and all of these factors. So yeah, how would you handle this as sort of a bridge to kind of getting started, or I guess kind of helping people to see that this is actually a challenge that we might need to address?
So it's a really good question. So thanks, Daniel. There are lots of organizations who are still kind of obsessed with resource utilization and kind of loading people up to 100%, even though there's really, really quite basic awareness around things like queuing theory that say, look, as soon as you get, for certain kinds of work patterns, as soon as you get to about 80% loaded, then the wait times will start to head towards infinity. So, and this stuff has been known for quite a long time, and it is relatively basic, but it's not really taught in management schools. It's not really taught it's not really made very aware in kind of business context. So, obviously, things like Kanban or particularly things like work in progress limits could start to help with this. If organizations are interested in becoming better, you can start to apply some of those kind of principles, perhaps to a small area first, and say, hey, look, by limiting the number of things we're doing at the same time, we actually achieve a faster flow, which we achieve a higher throughput. Now, it seems counterintuitive to lots of people, but in practice, the mathematics is pretty straightforward. There's another book. Hey, there's another book from IT Revolution, the same publisher, called Making Work Visible, and it's by Domenica de Grandis. There is a copy on my bookshelf behind me somewhere.
Great
book.
Yeah.
It's a great book, and so Domenica talks about very practical techniques for bringing work to the surface, literally making it visible, either in a physical office with kind of post-its and things, or more recently using tools like Miro or kind of online Kanban boards and this kind of thing, and forcing conversations around what are we doing and why, and demonstrating that by having a much tighter focus, specifically limiting work in progress in the right way, can help us finish things quicker. So that's where I will start to demonstrate some fairly straightforward, fairly basic techniques around focusing on the flow of work and the throughput rather than utilization of individuals.
Yeah, I like that. I think it makes a lot of sense to help people kind of connect to what the actual challenge is. And I can also add a +1 to Domenica's book. I've seen it so many times with groups of folks, is that you kind of start with building some kind of visualization, and just having them sort of step back and finally see just how much stuff they're actually trying to do is enough to kind of convince them already, without you even having to ask the question. It's like, yeah, maybe 400 projects for 100 people is nuts, and we should try something a little bit different. So it makes the conversation a little bit easier if people convince themselves of the problem. So yeah. Klaus, you had a question.
Yeah, I found a question in the comments, and I kind of like this one. Rita Goodbye asks, how many teams interacting with each other are too many, you think? So, I mean, team topologies, it's a lot about, interacting teams. I mean, I'm quite selfish. Flight levels is the same. It's also a lot about interacting teams, and I've find this question quite often, or I reflect about this question quite often actually. So I'd like to think what you think about it.
So it depends on the kind of interaction you're talking about. In the Team Topologies book, we define 3 different kind of interaction modes that we think are the only 3 that we really need. The first is collaboration. So 2 teams working closely together for a defined period to achieve a specific outcome. So usually discovery of something. How are we going to make this logging service better? Or what do we need this API to do? Well, that's quite intensive, right? So how many kind of active collaborations can you have within a team? Our recommendation is at any one time, one team should only have 1 collaboration with another team, because otherwise it's too many. You can't focus properly. We're discovering something. Let's focus on that discovery. Let's basically really reduce our work in progress down to focus on this thing. The second interaction mode that we talk about is X as a service. One team is producing and one team's consuming something. Now, if we get the boundary right, if we get a good boundary between producer and consumer of a service, the amount of interaction is actually quite limited. It's kind of friction free. We should almost have, it should be very limited amount of kind of communication to be able to consume something as a service, if we've got the boundary right. So a team could produce or consume quite a large number of these services. So therefore you could have quite a large number of interactions that are X as a service, because the cognitive overhead is quite low and there's very little friction. And then the final interaction mode we talk about is facilitating. Typically that's used by enabling teams, but again, like a mentoring interaction. So if we've got inside a streamlined team, typically we'd expect to have a mentoring relationship with only kind of 1 enabling team, for example, at a time. And 1 enabling team should probably be focused on 1 or 2 or maybe 3, a small number of streamlined teams at the same time, because otherwise it's too difficult to have the right kind of focus. So for us, collaboration should really just be like a 1-to-1 relationship. Facilitating could be a small number to a small number. You have a small number of teams involved in that facilitation, whereas X as a service should be very low friction and should scale really well. So you can have many more of those kind of relationships, X as a service, where you're producing or consuming something. Again, it's kind of driven by cognitive load. It's driven by focus. It's driven by what are we trying to achieve.
Yeah. I really like that, because you basically said it depends and then clarified what it depends on, which is my favorite answer to that question. There's always nuance, and of course it depends, but yeah, it's nice that you tell us.
It's basically driven by the overhead, because X as a service is very low overhead, so you can scale that much better. But the other kind of ways of interaction, particularly collaboration, has a very high overhead, and so let's just keep that simple. Just have a single relationship there. So that's what we recommend in the book anyway. It seems to work well. It's a nice question. Thank you.
So, yeah, really cool. So there's a couple of questions here about how to get started. So Gabriel, I think it's pronounced Pichinho or Pichinho, something like this. My Brazilian or my Portuguese at least, is quite poor. But maybe Umberti or Gabriel, you can tell me this is correct. The question here is, in large enterprise environments, how do you start? Do you look at the team's dependencies? Do you do some sort of value stream map? And then just as a second question, Maya Rao is asking, what could be classed as a good starting point, which is very similar question in that space.
There's a few different starting points depending on kind of where in the organization you're looking. If you're looking inside a team that is kind of building a customer-facing service or product, you could try to assess the cognitive load that they currently have. So basically, there's another question here which is actually worth answering at the same time, from Gregor's. different ways of assessing cognitive load. The application using cognitive load in a team context is quite a new thing. Cognitive load traditionally has been very much focused on an individual and a learning context. Applying it to teams is quite new. So it's quite early for team-based cognitive load assessment techniques. Manuel and I are working on some of those techniques. We're working with a couple of people with PhDs in psychology and related fields. We're working on some ways to kind of assess that properly. But to get started, you can just ask these streamlined teams, do you feel like there's too much to think about? Do you understand enough about the systems you're working on to feel confident that the changes you're making are effective? You go for the emotions, basically. Go for the emotional stuff, because you'll get through to the the gut feel, if you like, the underlying senses, and that's kind of fine. If people are saying we're happy with the systems we're working with, no problem at all, that's fine. If people say we really don't understand what's happening, there's far too much to understand, then you've already got a useful answer which suggests this team has got too much to think about. You can track other things as well. For example, if the speed, if the velocity or the throughput in a particular team is starting to go down, that might be one indicator that they're reaching the limits of cognitive load or possibly exceeded it. So for streamlined teams, you could start with looking at what kind of cognitive load they have in place at the moment. If you're working with teams who are providing services kind of from a platform, something like that, a good starting point is actually to try and define what that platform looks like. Just write it down. How many services are you providing? What kind of what hours of operation do those services need to have? Are they working 24/7, or is it just during office hours? What kind of users are you providing these services for? So typically those users are going to be internal users, developers, testers, these kind of people. So define your users, show what your roadmap looks like. So as a platform, we should expect these days, 2020, heading into 2021, to be treating this platform kind of like a product, using product management techniques and so on. So what's the roadmap? How's it going to evolve? What does the onboarding documentation look like? How easy is it for developers to use your platform? These kind of fairly basic questions, really, from a product management perspective, but actually apply that to your existing stuff and try to work out where the gaps are. And that seems to be quite effective.
Cool. So I want to ask a piece of my question, and then I'm going to talk about something else, and then I'm going to come back while I give you a minute to think. But I'm curious about what's kind of the next step for this. You've written a book, and you've obviously had a lot of work that's come from this, and you've been quite busy as a result. But I'm curious, like, what was kind of, when you're writing a book, you have to edit some stuff out and leave it out and so on. What's kind of the next thing that you would explore if you had some time? And while you're giving that some thought, just to give you a minute, I want to actually do a quick punt. For those of you who are interested, you can learn some more about Matthew and Manuel's work. So have a look at the teamtopologies.com/training for their workshops. And of course, on the rest of the website, bunch of information. You can get a copy of the book. There's several other really interesting articles and some links and videos and so on to have a look at if you're keen to check that out. And of course, although we're not talking specifically about flight levels today, I would be amiss if I didn't mention we have the online self-paced introduction to flight levels. There's community access and a whole bunch of stuff. So if you're interested to learn kind of more about the foundations of flight levels, give it a look. And of course, if you use the discount code FlightClub20, that will also give you 20% off and make it even more accessible. Cool. And last thing I want to say, actually, while we're doing a quick advertising break, is just to say, if you like this video, please hit the like button. It really does help more people to be able to see and know about this content, and does us a huge favor. And of course, hit the subscribe button, and you will know about new videos and content in the future. So yes, I think I've probably given Matthew enough time to think, but for those of you who were listening on the stream, the question is basically, in the process of writing a book, there's obviously some things you have to leave out, and there's probably something sort of on the edge of Team Topologies, or just kind of around the corner that's maybe about to emerge, or maybe something, if you will. I've just been reading this really fantastic, unrelated book called The Art of Gathering. And one of the things that they talk about in this book is trying to get people to talk about what she calls their sprout speeches rather than the stump speech. The stump speech being the core thing that you always tell people, right? This is my skills and my resume. I want to hear about the edge cases. What are your sprout speeches? What's kind of the idea that's on the fringes, so to speak? Over to you, Matthew.
So it's a nice way of putting it. So just going out from the trunk a little bit, so the sprouts closest to the trunk, we're doing some work around agile coaching and how agile coaches in particular, and organizational coaches in general, but particularly agile coaches can help with making some of this kind of more modern approach to organization dynamics work really well. I think that's a really interesting space. So if there's any agile coaches on the call, I'd love to hear from if you've got any experience with using kind of team topologies and these kind of approaches inside your organization. We're doing a whole bunch of work around DevSecOps, well, security and compliance in particular, and how we can use techniques like kind of automated governance and automated checks for things like compliance and security in this kind of context. Because clearly we can't have these manual checks like happened in the past. We have to be basically fully automated. But how do we get governance working at scale with some things automated, but then combining, enabling teams and so on of experts to and how do we check that these streamlined teams are actually compliant and within governance? So that's kind of some pragmatic stuff, which is kind of really important for making this kind of stuff work at an enterprise scale. Some of the stuff that we took out of the book. So the book is there's 55,000 words in here. We actually wrote 30,000 more. So the book would have been almost half as thick again, but we had to take some out. That's the decision of the publisher, and it's totally fine because it made it a nice good size for the book. So we got 30,000 words on stuff that we wasn't quite good enough to go into the book. Some of that was around other ways of diffusing learning across the organization. Things like communities of practice, internal talks, dojo. Someone mentioned actually there was a comment about, is an enabling team a kind of dojo? So the answer is sort of yes. It's very close to that kind of model. Because we need to find ways of having kind of diffuse learning across the organization. With streamlined teams and this kind of approach, there's a danger in some organizations that take it to the extreme. There's a danger that these teams do not speak to other teams, which is not what we intended at all. That's not the right way to think about it. So we need to have this kind of ecosystem of other ways of sharing awareness across other teams. Lunchtime talks, things like internal tech conferences. You might run every 6 months or something like that, and get people to prepare and share a talk on something that they'll be working on, and this kind of thing. So other dojos, other ways of learning that are kind of outside of building a system. So if the way in which we learn, if the only way in which we learn is when we're building the system, the danger is that the communication paths start to shape the system. So we have to find ways of learning and sharing information that are not directly related to building the system, that are kind of outside of that. And so all of these kind of community-focused ways of learning are, well, interestingly, community-focused ways of learning are predictive of high organizational performance. That also came out of the Accelerate book and the State of DevOps report since 2013. So if you want high organizational performance, you should be expecting to grow and nurture these kind of community learning initiatives. So we're going to do some more stuff on that space and how that kind of relates to Team Topologies.
Nice.
That's plenty, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of other stuff I'm doing. I do a lot of work around. Lower level engineering practices. So I do a lot of focus at the moment on operability and very practical techniques for teams to make their software work better in the production environment. Practically speaking, if these streamlined teams are, if these you build it, you run it teams, streamlined teams are running their services in production. Some of these people have never seen a production environment. How do they know how to write good logs? How do they know how to kind of emit metrics in a way which is useful? So there's some really practical technique that these teams actually need as well.
Yeah, nice.
I really like this, and I think, sorry, Klaus, I think there's also a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, we've been chatting just generally about kind of the connection between what you're doing with Team Topologies, and it kind of, I see it as sort of like almost like a sort of a supporting piece that Flight Levels kind of sits right next to and says, okay, cool. So we've talked about how all of these teams fit together, but now we have whole products and services, and we need to work with marketing and with legal and with all the product managers and so on. And so I think there's some very interesting conversations. Well, I hope there's some very interesting conversations in our future to see maybe there's some interesting points that we could sort of build on and collaborate a little bit closer together. So thanks once again to Neil for the introduction, because I didn't know about your book before he mentioned it, and I read it and was like, this is fantastic. We need to talk some more. So it's pretty cool, because I think there's a lot of interesting common ground. Anyway, I want to kick it back to you, Klaus. I think you had another question.
Yeah, I've seen another question here from Jose Casal, and Jose Casal is also a Flight Levels guide. And I think you can hear the Flight Levels guide in the question. Oh, by the way, Jose, it's his birthday today. Happy birthday, Jose.
It is his birthday.
Yeah. Okay, what is the question? Can we define the size of the team? So, especially for a Streamline team, for instance. So, in Flight Levels, it's so this would be like a Flight Level 2 system, would be similar to a Streamline team. But usually Flight Level 2 systems, well, there could be 30, 40, up to 300 people working in one Streamline team. And even, I mean, if we think outside of IT, because Flight Levels also is quite, it's not only IT, that's what I mean. So what is your definition of a team, actually?
So when we say team in Team Topologies, we have a very specific meaning, which is a group of people no bigger than 8 or 9. That remains together for an extended period of time, has a singular focus, works together. That is the smallest unit of doing work. We don't break it down into individual people. And the reason why for us team has that limit of people, 8 or 9, is because this is the limit of high trust between human beings. There's a very human-centric way of thinking about building software, or kind of approaching any problem, really. There's been plenty of research into kind of high-performing teams from the military and from kind of emergency services and things like this. Certainly in most contexts, about 8 people is the largest group you can get to have very, very high performance, or specifically very, very high trust. And the high trust builds high performance, enables you to go very, very quickly. It seems like in some organizations, you kind of have a group which is about 15 people. Effectively, that's 2 of these teams kind of brought together, paired together. And we see that in sports teams, right? So the only sports team, the only kind of sport that I found so far that exceeds 15 people, that has more than 15 people on the field, is, of course, Australian rules football, I think. Cliff, you might be able to correct me on this. But I think there's more than 15 on the field. But I think that's the only sport that I've certainly found so far that has more than 15 people on the field in one team. And if you speak to people who play rugby, they'll tell you that. So if rugby has 15 people on the field from one team, they'll actually tell you that it feels like 2 teams, forward and back. And so you've got 8 or 7 people in each team. And it's about trust. It's about trust. That's why there's this kind of limit. It's a human limitation or advantage, depending on your viewpoint. So we're going to work with it. It turns out that there are several kind of what some people call social inflection points. Effectively, these are trust boundaries. There's a boundary around about 8, a boundary around about 15, a boundary around about 50 people, a boundary around about 150 people. And these boundaries can be found in human contexts in lots of different situations. The key thing is we cannot just assume that the rules that apply in a small group are going to apply in a very large group. And we have to expect that the trust will change and therefore result in different kinds of behaviors as we cross one of these kind of trust boundaries. The boundary around about 150 people seems particularly important, so we have to. For us, a team is this very small unit because that's the group that can go fastest and has the highest trust. But then there might be some other kind of groupings. We don't really make too many kind of predictions or hard and fast rules about these other groupings, but there has been quite a lot of research around this area, and it does affect the kind of trust that we can have between different people as these groups get bigger. So we have to expect for different kind of dynamics to emerge as our organizational units or departments or groupings kind of grow and get bigger. We have to think about splitting these to enable us to retain a high level of trust inside this grouping.
Yeah. I was just thinking about this and in the context of kind of a lot of the work that I do, and actually one of the clients that I'm doing work with right now has a very sort of similar situation, but across multiple teams. And so as we're building our level 2 system across all of the teams, what they're starting to notice is that there actually are some kind of clusters and certain boundaries, and they tend to sort of emerge at around about the 150 people kind of mark. And it's exactly the same sort of thing, that at some point you kind of need that trigger to say, okay, we actually see that the smaller units tend to function a little bit better. And so, you know, it's a sort of evidence-based approach rather than just saying, well, you know, the number was just kind of pulled out of the air. And quite often what you see is that beyond that size, people will start adding more people in, but somehow the output and the outcomes that those groups are producing, it has a very distinct sort of diminishing returns. And as you see that sort of thing flattening off, that's usually where you can start to say, okay, at this point, we need to have a conversation about how do we split the systems or the different teams, different departments. You know, maybe there's multiple level 2 systems within this context. And so, you get it at sort of multiple levels of scale. It's not possible for everybody to know everybody. And you know, sort of a small family unit and then the bigger family gathering is somehow a different thing. And then when you think of yourself in the context of a city or a town, again, it's a whole other different thing. Many different models.
And maybe one more.
So I'm just conscious.
One more thing. A flight level 2. Sure. Just a flight level 2 is actually not a team. A flight level 2 is a certain amount of teams, but they are somehow stream-aligned. Like they need to produce or bring a product to the market. Like for instance, I don't know, a drilling machine or something like this. So you have many component teams, platform teams, specialists in procurement, and everything is involved to put this product on the market. So it consists of multiple teams. But I like the topic stream-aligned. So it's pretty much the same, but you are talking about the team and we're talking about the interactions between multiple teams, like in a stream-aligned way, kind of, on a flight level 2.
Yeah.
But
Cool. So my clock says that we're wrapping up in 2 minutes.
True.
And normally what I like to do is kind of close off with a question that kind of is a good ending point. So normally I would ask something sort of about tips or tricks or whatever, but there's actually a really great question, I think, in the chat. James Scrimshire is asking, he says, what are some common misapplications of these patterns that you see? And I want to sort of add a little piece to this, is that like, one of the things that I notice often, we go on a training course, we learn a bunch of stuff, and then people get excited, go and use it. But maybe, as we started with, sort of saying, maybe there's a context in which it's specific. So I want to kind of say, you know, is there a context or is there a type of anti-pattern or some kind of problem that you see emerging that maybe people struggle with or they misapply as a place to kind of close off?
It's a good question. We've not seen anything really disastrous yet. We have seen some kind of large enterprise software delivery frameworks Team Topologies patterns, but in a way which is not going to give the best outcomes to the people who are following those large scale approaches to software delivery. But we're having a conversation with those people. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see in organizations is in adopting kind of modern software delivery techniques and approaches for the platform. Because traditionally platforms were just a kind of aggregation. Well, they were an aggregation of stuff that no one else wanted to own. They were a way to share costs. They were a way to kind of protect valuable infrastructure or critical infrastructure and so on. Moving from that world to a new world of platform as a product, where we're using proper product management techniques, where we've got user experience as a real key focus, sometimes called developer experience, where we're listening to our internal development team customers, and we've got a proper roadmap and all this kind of stuff. It's a very different way of working. Effectively, we're using software techniques in a traditional platform or infrastructure or data space. There's a kind of clash of approaches in that space, and so that seems to be a real challenge. But I think that's probably the biggest challenge. Potentially in the book, we could have emphasized even more the need to use kind of modern software development techniques like these inside a platform. That's certainly where lots of organizations they'd be struggling, but there's a big opportunity, because inside organizations that build software, we have people who are UX people. We've got people who are product managers. We've got people who understand about user experience and user personas and roadmap and speaking to customers. So we can use expertise, but we bring it inside into the internal platform. So that's the opportunity in that space.
Cool. Awesome. Before we go, I just want to say to everybody, we'll be back again on the 21st of December with one last episode for this year. And then we're taking a break, and we'll see you again in the new year. Matthew, I want to say thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm looking forward to talking to you more about this. So thank you so much for making time to join us. And
thank you for inviting me.
Today.
It's been great. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Cool. And thank you to everyone on the live stream for the wonderful questions. Sorry we didn't get time to answer all of them. I have no doubt that we'll need to do something again in the future, and we will see what we can do with the rest of your questions. Cool. Have a great time and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks everyone for coming. Cheers.
Thank you, Matthew. Everyone. And say hi to Manuel, and next time he's with us. Okay. Cool. Cheers. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.